Well, today we're looking at a particularly significant instance of irony in the book of Samuel. Now, Samuel, of course, comes after Judges, and in the Judges, Israel has suffered under a lack of leadership. The key phrase for the book of Judges was captured those last two stories. It was a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so there was a lack of godliness and there was a lack of leadership. So the people of Israel were looking for, to use the metaphor that's used in Samuel, they were looking for a good shepherd who would lead them into the blessings of the Mosaic covenant and ultimately to the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. And thus Israel called out in the book of Samuel for a king, like all the other nations, who would be able to do that. And their timing was out. God always wanted them to have a king because in Deuteronomy chapter 17, there are actually provisions for the king of Israel. So it was always on God's agenda for Israel to have a king. It was just that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel became impatient and they wanted a king for the wrong reasons. And they wanted a king like all the other nations, and so God gave them a king like all the other nations, and that was King Saul. But I want to look at the life of King David by analysing three of the stories that we have of him. One at the beginning of his life, one at the midpoint, if you like, of his life, and then the other at the end. And the first story to look at is the story that's commonly referred to as David and Goliath. But erroneously, I believe, because really the story is about David and Saul. And Goliath is really a bit-part character who is used to contrast the shepherdry, if you like, of King Saul versus King David, or would-be King David. But it's in 1 Samuel chapter 17, so turn there if you would in your Bibles, or listen along. The story begins with the Philistines and the Israelites camped on opposite sides of the valley, drawing up for battle. And in verse 4, we are introduced to Goliath. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Now what's fascinating is that the writer of Samuel has spent a good 3 verses describing Goliath, and particularly describing his armour. And what's happening here is that the writer is setting up this story by focusing on the bad guy. It's like all the latest Hollywood blockbuster superhero movies. They always begin by showing you how bad the bad guy is. And they go on about it so that you're thinking, wow, this guy is so bad and so mean and so nasty that even our hero, I can't see how he's going to beat him. Well, that's what's happening here in Samuel. He's really painting a picture of Goliath as huge, as strong, as having all the latest technology, as unbeatable. And Goliath comes out, verse 8, and he shouted to the ranks of Israel. And he said, why do you come out? Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Then the Philistines said, this day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. And then here's a key verse in the story, verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So what's being pictured here is a predator, Goliath, coming against God's flock. And Saul, as the king of Israel, is God's appointed shepherd for his flock. But rather than defend his flock, what Saul is doing is being terrified. His knees are trembling, he's knocking together. And so because the shepherd is terrified, of course all Israel will be terrified against this predator. Now, you may be familiar with the story. What happens is that David is serving his father as a shepherd, and he comes to bring provisions for his brothers who are in the Israeli army. As David comes, he hears Goliath hurling insults upon Israel and Israel's God. And in verse 26, it says, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now, this is only the second time really where we've seen David. We meet him first in chapter 16 when Samuel anoints him. Here, we see him again, and almost immediately we take a liking to him, because when he sees Goliath, he doesn't see a huge, unstoppable monster. What he sees is a pagan who is defying the God of Israel and who needs to be dealt with. He sees Goliath for what he is, a predator that the shepherd must deal with, whereas Saul sees him as a terrifying presence. David here in verse 26 has a heart for God and has a heart for God's reputation. So they tell him what will be done for the guy who is able to defeat the Philistine. And verse 32, David says to Saul, and David, remember, is still a boy here, he's a teenager. Saul is a man, and he's the king of Israel. And David says to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And so there's a huge contrast between David and Saul. David, the boy, has courage. Saul does not. David has a shepherd heart. Saul does not. In fact, the first time we saw Saul was in 1 Samuel chapter 9, and he couldn't find his father's donkey. First time we see David is in chapter 16, when he is faithfully tending his father's flock. So straight away, in the way that these two characters are presented to us from the get-go, we see a difference in their ability to shepherd. In that case, livestock, but here the contrast is in how they shepherd people. Saul replied, verse 33, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy, and he's been a fighting man from his youth. And that reveals Saul's mindset. He's still thinking as man thinks, not as God thinks. And so he's saying, given your size, given the technology, given the experience, there's no way we can win this battle. Saul is not factoring God into the equation. But look at verse 34. David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defiled the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. Can you see what David is saying here? He's saying, I've been a shepherd. I've had predators come against the flock before, and God has delivered those predators into my hands. This Goliath is just another predator coming against the flock of God's people, and God will deliver me into his hand. Tremendous faith, tremendous courage, tremendous insight into the God of Israel from David, which really shows up all that is lacking in Saul and in Saul's leadership. So Saul says to David, go, the Lord be with you. And then Saul dresses David in his own tunic, puts his armor on him, helmet on his head, gives him the sword, and basically saying, okay, David, you're going to fight this war. Here's all my technology and expertise. Take it with you. Again, Saul is not getting it. He's not factoring God into this equation. He's trying to fight the enemy on the enemy's terms, trying to fight against the world, if you like, with worldly tactics. But David says, I cannot go with these, he said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So he took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of his bag, and approached the Philistine. And you know the rest of the story. He comes out, Goliath mocks him. David, in the name of God, slays him. He comes, I come against you, David said to Goliath, in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. And he lets Goliath know that he is defiling the God of Israel, and for that reason he will be slain. And immediately David strikes him down with a slingshot, runs over, and then cuts his head off with Goliath's own sword to fulfill the law, because the law says that anybody who defied God, who blasphemed against God, should have his head cut off. And so in that story, in 1 Samuel 16, it really shows that David is a wonderful shepherd with a heart for God and a heart for God's people who will stand up and protect God's flock, whereas Saul is empty of any courage and any leadership ability, and it seems of any faith that is going to help him in his role. Could David be the good shepherd who's going to lead his people into green pastures, who's going to help them enter into the blessings of the Mosaic and the Abrahamic covenants? Well, it would appear that he is. And David's career takes off. And Saul dies, of course, and then David becomes the king. When he becomes king, he has a desire to build God a house. That God says to David, you're a man of war, I'm going to have your son, who will be a man of peace, build the house, but go ahead and build it. But nonetheless, in 2 Samuel 7, he says, David, you've wanted to build me a house, but I tell you what, I'm going to build you a house. And in 2 Samuel 7, we have the Davidic covenant, where God promises David that he will never lack a descendant on his throne. And the key terms of the Davidic covenant are house, kingdom, and throne, in which God promises that to David. So David, I will build your house, don't you worry about building my house. But then we come to the second story I want to look at, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And it's a story of David and Bathsheba. And here's where the irony begins, because David has been king for a while now. And unfortunately, he has grown proud and he has grown arrogant. So we pick up the story in verse 1 of chapter 11. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with his king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Key verse sets everything up. It's a time when kings go off to war, but David, the king, doesn't go off to war. Rather, he sends Joab and he stays in Jerusalem. So right there, I believe the author is making a point. He's saying David was not where he should have been. He should have been with his soldiers. He wasn't. Also, by the way, that word sent that you saw in verse 1 is a key word in this story. The word refers to sovereignty, really, and it refers to who is in control. And so David is going to present in chapter 11 as the one who's in control, but we'll see there's going to be a play on that at the end of the story. Verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed, walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. And the man said, Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? That's significant because what that's saying is, isn't this Bathsheba the wife of one of your trusted servants, one of the granddaughter of a trusted counselor, the wife of one of your mighty men? David knew these men. So therefore, this betrayal that he is going to undertake is not abstract. It is very calculated, and it is against what used to be some dear friends of his. And notice again that David sent someone to find out about her, and the man said it's Bathsheba. So there, verse 4, David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he slept with her. And then it says she had purified herself from her uncleanness, which gives us a clue as to why she was bathing on the top of the roof. In Israel, the Middle East, top of a roof was another room of a building, and what it seems to me that Bathsheba was doing was cleansing herself from her period. Her period was over, she had been cleansed, and she was cleansing herself according to the rites of purification. So she wasn't being provocative, she wasn't doing anything wrong. But David slept with her, and who knows, that could have been rape. He could have forced himself on her, we don't know. But we're certainly not told that there was any cooperation from Bathsheba's point of view. Then you have the first little bit of irony taking place, because in verse 5 it says, the woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, I'm pregnant. So for the first time in the story, David's not in control. Previously, he sent Joab into battle. He sent to find out about Bathsheba, then he sent for Bathsheba, but now Bathsheba sends him notice that he's pregnant. So David tries to take control again, verse 6, and he sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. David's trying to manipulate things. He wants Uriah to come home so that he'll sleep with his wife and cover over the pregnancy. So Uriah comes back in verse 8. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. So David says to Uriah when he comes back, "Hey, go down to your home, be with your wife," and he sends along a present to help with the ambiance of the occasion, so that Uriah will be in the mood, as it were. But look at verse 9. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you just go home?" Here David is almost questioning Uriah's manhood. He's saying, "You've been away from your wife for a long time and you don't want to go sleep with her? What's wrong with you, man? Aren't you red-blooded like the rest of us?" And then Uriah says to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Wow, that is a real sting to David. That is a slap in the face to David. Uriah is saying, how can I go and enjoy my wife when all my comrades, my fellow soldiers, and the ark of God, and God himself, if you like, are out on the battlefield risking their lives? I can't indulge myself like that. My heart and my sympathies are with the troops. That's exactly where David's heart and sympathies should have been, but they weren't. He had no problem in enjoying Uriah's wife while everybody else was out fighting. Verse 12, plan B for David. David said to her, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained at Jerusalem the next day. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. That was his second plan, getting drunk, sending back to his wife. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servant. He did not go home. What's ironic there is that Uriah is obedient to God even when he is drunk. David is disobedient to God even when he is sober. Plan C, verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he'll be struck down and die." Plan C for David was to have Uriah killed, one of his mighty warriors, one of his friends. And of course, Joab takes his own death warrant, gives it to Joab. Joab reads it, obeys, sends a messenger back to David to let him know that Uriah has died, and this messenger is fearing for his life because he has bad news. He tells David what has happened, and David takes the news quite well, it seems. And then here's plan D, verse 26, chapter 11. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. It's because she loved her husband. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So plan D, David acts like a hero. His wife, the wife of Uriah, a war hero, is now bereft of a husband, and so the king comes to the rescue and looks after the widow. Last word of the chapter is the first time God's name appears in the story. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. And then we get to chapter 12. The Lord, now that he's in the picture, sent Nathan to David. See the reversal of that use of the term? Previously, all by one time, David has been sending. David's been in control because he's arrogant, he's proud. But now, God's going to deal with David. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "David, there were two men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he'd bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, a traveller came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveller who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." Great story from Nathan. but one that David could really relate to. And before Nathan finished the story almost, David interjects, and burning with anger against the man, he said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are that man. Now, what's ironical about this story is that David, who started out as a great shepherd, has now actually become the predator. And that's what that story from Nathan underscored. David, you have preyed upon the flock that God has made you protector over. You have become a predator when once you were the shepherd. And you will pay 4 times for what you've done. You deserve to die. And indeed, David did deserve to die. But this is the basis for Psalm 51, where David pleads for mercy, because he knows that under the law, he's committed adultery and he has committed murder. Both of those are capital offences. There's no provision under the law for his forgiveness. And so he casts himself on God's mercy in Psalm 51. And Nathan says, David, you are going to pay 4-fold for this, for what you have done. And indeed, in the following chapters, the death of 4 of his sons are going to be recorded. More than that, from this point on, David's family life is going to be a mess. His family is going to unravel before his very eyes. And indeed, it's because he lacks, it seems, the moral courage and integrity and confidence to step in where he should. 2 Samuel 13 is a tragic chapter about the rape of Tamar by one of David's sons, by Tamar's half-brother. And David doesn't do anything in that chapter. It's a shocking example of a poor father at work. But then, at the end of his life, there's yet a further story, because now doubt is cast upon David as to whether he will be that good shepherd who will lead the people of Israel into the blessings of the covenants. Go to 2 Samuel, chapter 24, the last chapter of the book of Samuel. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go and take a census of Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many there are. So what David is doing here is he's taking a census of his army. Again, an act of pride. He's basically saying, I want to know how strong I am. I want to know how great I am. It's like one of these young guys who's in the mirror with his bodybuilding. He's looking at his muscles. You know? Oh, how big are my muscles? How great am I? So it's a real act of pride. Joab in verse 3 said, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does the lord the king want to do such a thing? Now, if you know anything of Joab's character, he was a ruthless man. He was a hard-nosed soldier in general. And yet Joab is saying to King David, this is not a good idea. So if someone like Joab says this is not a good idea, it's probably not a good idea. Yet David, verse 4, is resolute. And so the Joab goes and they conduct a census. As soon as the numbers come back, verse 10, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, O Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. So he recognizes his sin, but it's too late. Or at least, potentially, it's too late. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord came to Gad the prophet, David's seer. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So God says to David through Gad the prophet, David, you've sinned, I'm going to punish you. But I'm giving you 3 options. In fact, David, what's happening is I'm giving you a multiple choice exam. And there is a right answer to this exam and there's a wrong answer. Let's see how you go. So Gad went to David and said to him, A, shall there come upon you 3 years of famine in your land? Or B, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you? Or C, over 3 days of plague in your land. Now think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. A, B, C. David, do you want famine? A, flee from your enemies? B, or a plague? C. How does David respond? Verse 14. David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. The pronouns are really important there. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. How is David answering the multiple choice exam? A, B, or C? Well, he's basically saying, Lord, give me A, give me C, but whatever you do, do not give me B. Unfortunately, that is the wrong answer. Because of those three options, the only option that localizes the punishment to David himself and not the people of Israel is B. But David is at the end of his life here. He's already been chased around the desert by Saul. He's been chased in the wilderness by Absalom. He doesn't want to go through that again. He's tired. He's weary. He doesn't want to experience that again. So verse 15, the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family. Too late, verse 17. David says, Lord, I got the exam wrong. B, give me B, give me B. These sheep have done nothing wrong in that they've been slaughtered. So once again, but on a much grander scale, David has become a predator to the flock. Rather than protecting the flock, rather than taking the hit for the flock, like he did when he started his career in 1 Samuel 17 against Goliath, where he was prepared to die for the flock. Now he has become a huge predator of the flock and has allowed 70,000 of them to die for his own sin. David's life ends as a tragedy, just like Saul's life ended as a tragedy. David's life ends as a tragedy when it promised so much. David is not the good shepherd who will lead his people into blessing. That means when you get to the end of Samuel, the people of Israel are still looking for the good shepherd to come. This, I believe, is significant background to John chapter 10 when Jesus makes that wonderful declaration. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Jesus Christ is the only one true good shepherd who will be able to lead his people into the blessings of the covenant and into the green pastures and into solid food, because men like Saul and David are fragile and frail and sinful. That's the tragedy of David's life, and that's the irony in the book of Samuel.